Let's set up SQL Server and SQL Server Management Studio and connect to it from Power Automate Desktop. I'm Jensen, a Microsoft MVP. Let's learn some Power Automate Desktop. To install SQL Server and SQL Server Management Studio, we navigate to this URL. Scroll a little bit down and under Developer, click Download Now. That will download the executable. We will run it. That will open up the installation guide. Here you will choose the basic, accept, install, and we will fast forward. That's it. And now we will install the SQL Server Management Studio. So here you click Install SSMS. Scroll a little bit down here, download SSMS. Choose the free download for SQL Server Management Studio. That will download another executable. We will also open and run that. Here we will click Install. That's it. We can click Close here and we can close our browser. We will also choose to close here. And then we go to our Start menu. Search for SQL Server 2022 Configuration Manager. Click that one. Over here you will see the SQL Server and the status running. You can choose to click it and either right click and click Stop, Pause, or you can use these buttons up here. So it's running, that's great. I can close this one again. Then I go to the Start menu again and I type Management Studio. And this is the SQL Server Management Studio. I want to open it, so click here. And here we can connect to our database. You'll see the server name and the authentication. We're using Windows authentication and this server name is our workstation name. In case this is blank, we're going to find it. Go to your Start menu, type in CMD and click Enter. Now you type Who am I? Click Enter, and if I move it down here, you can see that this here, that is the server name. So simply just Control-C, Control-V, paste it in up here, and we'll click Connect. That's it. This is the SQL Server Management Studio. We have the overview over here. And to write a new query, I just go up here and click New Query. That will open up the query window to the right. Best practice is to write these queries in caps lock. So I'll click it on my keyboard here. And that is because these queries are easily written when they are in caps lock. We will start by creating a new database we can work on. So here you'll write create database and we will have the database name. Let's call it Blacklist, and to end the line I'll have a semicolon. Then click Enter, type in Go. Now we can execute this query by clicking Execute over here. That will create the database. If you want to inspect it, you can go over here to the plus into Databases, and you will see our newly created database over here called Blacklist. To use this database, I go over here to my query window again. I'll click Enter, and then I will say Use Blacklist, and I'll say semicolon again. I'll click Enter, and I'll say Go. Now I only want to execute the use blacklist and not the create database because we already created that. To do so, I just mark these two here and then I'll click execute. You will see down here that our commands completed successfully. If we try to create the database again, we would be getting an error. Now I want to create a table in my database. So I go up here and then I click enter. To create a table, I'll say create table, and then I'll give my table a name. I will call mine companies, like that. Then I will click enter. I'll have a parentheses start, and here comes my table. But let's create the end first. So I'll click enter twice. So I go down here. I'll have a parentheses end and a semicolon. I can also click enter once more and have a go here. Now go up here inside these parentheses. What I will do here is that I will say that, then a space, and I will disable the caps lock, and here I'll say int. That means that this VAT number will be of the format integer. Integer are whole numbers that could be 1, 0, 2, -5, whole numbers that is without decimals. Then I'll have another space. I'll enable the caps locks again, and here I'll say primary key. That means that this is the unique identifier for this table. Here I'll have a comma. I'll click enter. I'll also want the company name. So I write C, I disable caps lock, and I will say company underscore name. Then I'll have a space. Here I'll say var char, and I'll define that this will be 30 characters. I also want this company name to have a value. I will not allow null values. Null means nothing. It just doesn't mean an empty value. It means nothing. So here I'll say not null in caps, and I'll have a comma, and I'll click enter. I'll also have the last header, which will be reason, and here I'll say var char parentheses 40. That one could be a little bit bigger, and I'll have another comma. That's it. Let's try to run this query that will create the table in our database. So I mark this, I'll click execute, and if I go over here to Blacklist, then I can click this plus, and click plus, and in this tables you can see a DBO companies. That is the table that we just created. If I click this plus here, you can see if I go into columns, I click this plus here, you can see that we have the VAT, company name, and reason. Let's also fill some data into this table. So I click enter once more. To fill data into a table, again, I'll enable the caps lock. I'll say insert into, and then I'll take the companies. Here, if I start writing C, you can see that this intelligence comes up. The companies is marked. That means that I can just put in the tabulator on my keyboard and it will autofill. You should always use this intelligence since this reduces error. So we insert into the companies. I'll have a space and a parentheses start. Then I want to define the column headers. And here I'll just type in that, comma, caps lock, and I'll type C. Now you can see we have this intelligence comes up again. I can just press tab. I'll have another comma. Here I'll say R, reason. That's it. Then I'll click enter. Now I'll have the caps locks again. I'll say values like this. Then I'll click enter and I'll click the tabulator. Now I'll have a parentheses start, and we can start by creating the first row that will go into our table. So just write after me. I'll say 4, 5, 8, 6, 5, 7, 6, 4. That will be the first cell of this row. So I'll have a comma. I'll have a space, and this is just for readability. The first number here, that was our VAT number. That was an integer. We defined it up here. The next one, that is a var char, or a string of variable length. To type in the value of this, we need to surround it with single quotation marks. Let's call the first company sub photo like this, and have another single quotation mark. Now we need a reason. So here I'll have a comma, and again I will surround it with single quotation marks. Here I'll say didn't pay like this and another single quotation mark. Let's end the row by a parentheses end. Have a comma because we are ready for the next line. Click enter here and we can create the next one. I'll create it a little bit faster. Feel free to pause the video if things goes too fast. That's it. That's our 3 rows into our table. I'll click another enter and then I'll move back here and I'll have a semicolon. Click enter and I'll have a go. So this one will insert these value into our tables. So mark it here, click execute, and you will see that it says 3 rows affected. Let's fetch the data. So I go back here, I'll click enter. Again, I'll enable the caps lock. So here I just want to select all the data from the table called companies. To do so, I will say select. Then I'll have a star asterisk. That means that I will select everything. I'll click enter. Then I'll say from where should I take the data from? I'll take it from the companies like this. That's it. And here we don't really require a go. Let me explain what the go does. The go separates these queries into batches. That means that if we want to run it all at once, it will first run this, then it will run this, this, and this. In case we haven't done those, then we would get an error because these steps needs to be done sequential. But here, after we have this go, we can just select the data from companies. We don't need further goes. That means that if I mark this, I'll click execute. We now have selected all the data from this table. Let's say I want to fetch with the condition. I can go up here, I can click enter. I'll say where, and that will be where that equals, and let's give it a number. I can say 1, 2, 1, 5, 7, 3, 2, 1, and I will mark this. I will execute the query, and here you can see that we have our fetch data with our condition. Let's copy our queries. So I will Control A here in the query window. I'll say Control C, and I'll go down to my start menu. I type Notepad and open it. Let me drag it in from my other screen here, and I'll Control V. So now I have it stored here. Let's close down the SQL Server Management Studio. And here, do I want to save these queries amongst others? No, I don't really need that. The data will be in our database. We have now set up a SQL database. Please open Power Automate Desktop and create a new flow. Then we will create the SQL Server database with Power Automate Desktop. To connect to a SQL database, go up to Actions and find a Open SQL connection and drag it in. You can use the builder by clicking here, but it is rather slow, so I prefer to creating this connection string myself. First, we will have our driver. So start by writing driver equals, and then in curly brackets, I'll say SQL Server like this, and curly bracket end. Then I'll have a semicolon. Then I'll say server, and I'll connect to my local database. We set up the SQL Server in the previous lesson. If you haven't watched that, you can do it by clicking the video in the upper right corner. So here I'll say server equals, then I'll have a parentheses start, I'll say local, and a parentheses end. I'll have another semicolon, and here I'll say integrated security like this equals true, another semicolon, and then I'll have the database name. So I'll say database equals, and my database is called Blacklist, like this. This integrated security equals true. That means that we're using our Windows credentials. We have a variables produced called SQL connection. We can refer to that connection when we want to access this database. Go click save here. You can try to run it. So if I go up here and click run, it will take a few seconds, and if I go over here to SQL connection in flow variables and I double click here, we have opened it. That's fine. I can click close here. Usually you also want to close down this connection. So I go up to actions and then I'll find a close SQL connection and drag it in. This will just close our SQL connection that we have just opened, which is fine. But not much fun here. Let's also execute a SQL statement. So I go up to actions and then I'll find a execute SQL statement. Drag it in between the open and close. Here we will get the connection by our SQL connection variable, which we created up here. It's also possible to use a connection string here, but if we want to perform multiple queries, that is not preferred. The SQL statement, again, we will just use the SQL queries from the last lesson. Again, I will just use this select here. So I'll go copy it, go back here, and I'll paste it in here, Control V. You're also more than welcome to write your own SQL query. Down here, our variables produced is called QueryResult. That will contain the query result in a data table format. I'll click save. Let's try to run it now. So if I click run here, again, it will take around probably 10 seconds. We open it and we executed it. That's it. If I move over here to query result and double click it, you can see that we looked up this VAT number. We did it directly in the SQL Server Management Studio before, but here we have it. And now we can use Power Automate Desktop to connect to a SQL database. So I'll click close here. We have some sample data. I downloaded it to my desktop. You can find this Excel sheet in the video description. So if I double click this Excel sheet, and here I have my company sheet. This is a 4-column table. I'll have the VAT number, which is unique identifiers, that those are VAT numbers. I have a company name, and then I have 2 blank columns called company check and reason. I want to look up each VAT number in this Excel sheet. I want to look it up inside my SQL database. Here I want to know if these ones are blacklisted companies or OK companies. In case they are blacklisted, I also want a reason here, and that is the use case. So close this Excel sheet. We can also close down this notepad that we created before, so I'll do that. I want to grab the path of this companies here. Here I will say Shift right click. I'll move down and say copy as path. Back to Power Automate Desktop. In the beginning, I want a set variable, and I'll drag it in here. This will be my Excel path. So I go down here to variable, and then I'll say Excel path. And in the value, I'll say Control V. I'll remove the quotation marks in the start and in the end. Power Automate Desktop, don't use those. The reason why we're keeping this Excel path in a variable instead of just hard coding in an Excel action, is that this is best practice. This path can change and it will certainly not stay on my desktop, this Excel sheet. If I click save here, then if I come back to the flow and have moved my Excel sheet, I can easily change the value of this variable. Let's also launch Excel. So I go up here and I'll find a launch Excel and I'll drag it in here. Here I'll open up the following document. The document path, I just created that up here called Excel path. So I click this X and double click the Excel path. I'll not make my instance visible. If I scroll a little bit down, you can see here that the variables produced is called Excel instance. I'll refer to that one when I want to use this Excel book stored in the Excel path. Here I'll click save. I also want to read from this book. Now we're just launching it here with the launch Excel. So I go up to actions, then I'll find a read from Excel worksheet and I'll drag it in here. We're reading in the Excel instance. What do I want to retrieve? I click this drop down and I'll say all available values from the worksheet. That means that I get all the data inside this Excel sheet. You want to click advanced here because our data contains column names. Take that one. The variables produced, you can see here it's called Excel data. That will be a data table that we can work with. Click save here. What you also want to do is in the end, we want to close this Excel instance. So here I'll find a close Excel. I'll drag it down here. And for now, we will not save it. I will click save. Let's test run this, that we can actually open up the Excel, we can read from it, and we can close it again. We haven't connected the Excel to our SQL queries yet, but we will do so very soon. That's it. If you go over to your flow variables, Excel data, double click it here. Now we have our Excel sheet loaded into a data table so we can work with it. Let's iterate through this data table. So that is for each one of these rows, we want to use this VAT number in our query. Right now it's quite static. It says 12157320, but I want to use these VAT numbers one by one. Let me click close here. So go up to actions, find a for each, drag it in between the open and execute SQL statement. The value to iterate, that will be my Excel data. So click this X here, Excel data. This was the data that we loaded into our data table that came from Excel. Here we store it into a variable called current item. We can rename it. This is just the reference name. So I can say current company. That might be a little bit better because that says what's going on here. Here I'll click save. So now we're iterating through each value. Then let's drag in the execute SQL statement by taking it, bit the mouse, and dragging it into the for each. We need to replace this static value with the value from the Excel data, which will now be in the current company one by one. So double click here. Instead of this one here, I will delete it. We will use the current company because the current company, that is the current row. When we do this iteration one by one, that will get stored here. So first we will go over to this X variable picker. Always use this variable picker whenever you can. Then I'll say current company. But this will be the entire row. I only want the VAT number. So here I'll either need to put in the column index or the column name. Column name is most stable because people can put in extra columns. Of course, they can also rename columns, but that is less likely. To find the column name, click save here. Go over to your Excel data, double click, and the column name, that is VAT no with capital letters. So I'll click close here. I'll go into the execute SQL statement again, and I move over here. Here you will have a hard bracket, single quotation marks, that, space, no, then a single quotation mark, and a hard parentheses, end. And we will produce a variable called QueryResult. Let's try to write that one out. So I click Save here, and let's just have a display message. I'll drag it in, still inside the for each here. Let me drag it over here. I'll go down to Message to Display. I'll click this little X here, and I'll double click the query result. Go to variables produced. Let's not confuse ourselves. So I'll just untick this button pressed since we are not going to use it. I'll click Save. So what I will do here is that I'll run through this Excel data. Let me open it again. I'll look up each VAT number in our SQL database, and then I'll get a query result back. That means that if we can't find these VAT numbers in the SQL database, the query result will be blank. Let's go test it. So here I'll click Run. And again, it will just open. That will take like 5 seconds, and the queries will run very fast. So the first one was blank. I'll click OK. Blank. OK. Here we have a blacklisted company. Subphoto didn't pay. Blank. We have another one called Might Sam. That is root behavior. You'll see here that we get the entire row. That is fine. And we have the Labby post. Let me just run quickly to it. That's it. So our automation works now. Now we just need to make it a little bit beautier so we can write the query results back to Excel. So I will use an if. Go up here to Actions and then File an if. Here I'll drag it in after the execute SQL statement. And here I want to look at the query result. So if I go over to this X here, and here you can see the query result, that is also a data table. So if I first, let me just double click here. So I want to say how many rows are in this data table. And that means that if we have 0, we know that we have a blank result, then it's not a blacklisted company. If it's not 0, then it's a blacklisted company. So what I can do instead here, I can actually delete this and go back to this X. I can go down to query result and click this arrow here. And then I can take the rows count, for example. Let me double click here. If I'll say the operator, that will be not equal to 0, then I know I have a blacklisted company. Now I can click Save. Let's try to move the display message up here. So right now we will only print the blacklisted company. And then we have took another step in our solution for this entire project. We're opening it. You can see that we're running through. Now we have the first blacklisted company, the second, and we have the third. That's it. So now we're able to find 3 blacklisted companies in our data set. And now instead of using these display messages, let's update our data table called Excel data, and let's print that data table back to Excel. So first I will delete this display message. We'll need a helping variable, and that is because we want to know where to write it back into this table. That is not stored in the current company, so we don't know actually for each of these iterations, we don't know where we are. So we go up to Actions, and then we'll find a set variable. Again, this is just a helping variable. Drag it in just before the for each. We will call this one here row count, and we will give it the value 0. That is because data tables are 0 indexed. The first row is index 0. I'll click Save. Then I want to increase this variable by 1 here in the end. You can either use a set variable again or an increase variable. They do the same. I prefer the set variables, so I drag that one in here in the end. So go up to this X. We will update the row count. In the value, click the X again, row count. We're going to add 1 to it, and that is because for each iteration, we want to add 1 to it. So simply just go in here after the T and say +1, and we'll click Save. So now here in the if, that means that we know we have a blacklisted company. Then we want to update the Excel data. If I go over here to Excel data, I want to update the column called company checked. I want to have a blacklisted in here. And then the reason, that will be the reason that we have in our SQL database. So I'll click close here. We'll find another set variable and drag it in here. First of all, I want to update the Excel data table. So I click this X, double click the Excel data. But I also want to specify what cell and what column I want to update. So I go up here. And I can do that with indexes or variables or hard-coded values. First one, that is which cell I want to update, and I use the row count for that. Let me drag it over here and go in here. So I'll have a hard bracket here, and I'll use the row count variable. So I'll just type in row count. We are inside these percentage signs. That means that we don't need another pair of percentage signs. Then I can have a hard bracket end. I'll have a hard bracket start. And here I want to save it in the company check column. So I'll have a single quotation mark. And here I'll say company check, another single quotation mark, and then a hard bracket end. The reason here is that the company check, that is a text and not a variable. So this is a text variable coming from the data table. And what value do I want to fill in the company check? Well, we just go with blacklisted. That's what we know. So here I'll click save. Then we'll have another similar variable than this. And because we are lazy, I prefer just to mark this, Control C, Control V. I know we have two similar ones. Go in here. Now we're not going to update the company check, but the reason. So let me delete this company check. Type in reason instead. We want to move into the query result for the reason. So what I will do here is that I'll delete this blacklisted. To see what we're actually going to take out, I'll click save here. This will give us an error. That is fine. But I want to go into this query result. I know that this is empty, but if we have a blacklisted company, then we will have one row in this data table. That means that we can refer to this query result variable, then we can say 0 for the first row, and I want to get the reason back. Remember the query result that came from the execute SQL statement. I'll click close here. I'll move in here. So the value that should be, click the X here, double click the query result, move up here, and again we set the 0, and here I'll move into the reason column of the query result. So I'll say reason, and I'll have a hard bracket end. So I'm updating the Excel data, the row count, that will be the current row that we're in, and the reason column. I'll do that by taking the value from the query result, the first row, and the reason column. And that one we got from the execute SQL statement. Keep in mind that we are in the if, so we know that we have a blacklisted company. We know that we have something here. Then I can click save. So now that is done. I also want to have an OK value. If these two, if this if is not 0, that means that it equals 0, and that means that it's not a blacklisted company. I also want to have an OK value. But first I'll go up to actions, find an else, and drag it in here. And again, I'm lazy, so I have this in my clipboard. I click this end, and when I press Control V, that will paste in another one of this set variable. Double click to open it. Instead of blacklisted, I'll have the OK. Like this, I can click save. So now we are running through this with the data. I recommend you to go run it just to test it, to see that we can update our data table, and then if that works, we just need to write it back to Excel. So here we're running through all 10 rows. You can make it faster if you are changing this run delay to 1 can do this. This is just the run delay here in this editor. You'll only see it in here. When you move your robot to production, it will be a run delay of 1. And that is because you might often want to see what's going on when you're building these robots. Now go up to Excel data and click here. Here, there you go. We have now updated our Excel data table with the data from the SQL database. Now we just need to save this to our Excel sheet. So I'll click close here. Go up to actions and then find a write to Excel worksheet. Drag it down here between the close SQL connection and the close Excel. The value to write, that will be the Excel data. Double click here. Where do I want to write it? Since this is a data table, I can start by writing in the upper left corner, and then it will automatically fill in into the correct cells. I'll say column A and row 2. And that is because we have headers in row 1. So here I'll click save. One thing that we'll need to do is to go into close Excel, double click here, say save document, and we'll click save here. Now try to run this. Again, it will take a few seconds. If you like this video, then you can really help me a lot by giving it a thumbs up. That's it. Here we have closed it. Let me move out here. Let us go into companies. There you go. YouTube wants you to watch this video next. In case you want help with your Power Automate problems, then you should join the I Love Automation Discord. Your guide and invitation is right up here.